In certain countries, resistant movements were referred to as the underground. The exact number of people who took part in resistant movements during World War II is unknown, but there were thousands upon thousands of people involved. Resistant movements took place in many different countries, and in those countries, there were many different groups. Those groups would sometimes have different sets of beliefs and ideologies. For example, there were communist groups and non communist groups, and some people who were working for the resistance for moral reasons. And others were doing it because they didn't want Germany to come to the ruin at the hands of Hitler. But in the grand scheme of things, during World War II, all those people from all sides were working against Hitler and the Nazis. Resistance groups faced a lot of opposition, and by the end of the World War, many brave people who had been involved had been killed. While they might not have had as large an impact as hoped, resistances did have an important impact. Resistance movements activity consisted of several different things, such as guerrilla warfare, ambushing German patrols, hit and runs, terrorism, and raids, which were more violent activities they took part in. Less nonviolent activities were publishing newspapers against the Nazis, helping Jews and Allied airmen who had been shot down by the Nazis, gathering and passing along information to the Allied forces, and sometimes attempting to recapture towns.
There were large resistance movements in Germany in particular. It's estimated that around 800,000 Germans were arrested by the Gestapo for resistance activity during the course of the war. The resistance movements in Germany were made up of different groups. All these groups were not only made up of Germans, but also of many Jewish people who were able to escape being sent to a camp. Some of the resistance groups were secret, while others weren't. Not everyone was affiliated with a group. Civilians, for example, were not always. They would continue with their regular lives and work secretly against the Germans. Different groups had different opinions about the Allies, but they were all working commonly against Hitler. Some of the notable groups are the following. The White Rose Opposition Group, founded by Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans in 1942. They were medical students at a university at the time, and they spoke out about the genocidal policies of the Nazis. They would hand out anti-Hitler pamphlets to other students with the goal of creating a strong feeling against Hitler that would eventually lead to rebellion. The White Rose was stopped when a janitor at the university saw them with pamphlets and reported them to the Gestapo, who then had all the members executed. Another group was the Edelweiss Pirates. It was made up of working-class teenagers who helped Allies and Jews escape, distributed Allied propaganda, sabotaged and planned attacks on Hitler Youth and Nazis. And then there was the Red Orchestra Group, Black Orchestra Group, among many, many others. Another type of group was political opposition groups such as Social Democrats and Communist parties. Resistance movements also included armed partisan groups who practiced guerrilla warfare. These were people who refused to go to war to fight for the Germans, so instead took up arms and hid out in the forest. These groups would often include children. During the resistance in Germany, there were many events and protests that took place. Most importantly, there were many assassination attempts on Hitler by Germans, but all failed for one reason or another, either caught too soon or the plans did not play out properly. After the war, there were a total of 42 different known attempts, but of course there would have been more undocumented ones. In many of the cases, there was a man appointed to either shoot Hitler or carry out a suicide bombing near him, but in all those cases, the men involved were either caught before it could happen, or for one reason or another couldn't get close enough to Hitler. There were also different kinds of attempts. For example, in one case in 1939, during Hitler's victory parade in Warsaw, a group was waiting to detonate explosives that they'd hidden in a ditch by a certain road, but right before it was to happen, the parade suddenly got diverted. In another attempt in 1939, George Elser put a bomb at a place in Munich where Hitler was to give an annual speech. But Hitler left the place early before the bomb exploded. And then there was the July 20th plot, which was a very famous plot involving bombing the Wolf's Lair, which was Hitler's headquarters. It ended up killing 4 people, but not Hitler. Most of the people involved in assassination attempts were either sent to jails, prison camps, or executed. And then there were many protests. One of the notable ones is the Rosenstrasse protest. It happened on February 1943. It was the only large and open protest for Jews during the Third Reich, which was started after 1,800 Jewish men married to non-Jewish women were deported. Some important figures in the German resistance include the following: Oskar Schindler, who secretly saved 1,200 Jews by employing them. There was also Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor who strongly opposed the Nazis and even founded a seminary opposed to Nazism. He was also involved in the July 20th plot. He was later executed in a concentration camp in 1945. Then there was also Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was also important in the July 20th plot, as well as in the anti-Nazi circle. He was later executed by a firing squad, but not before he could say his final words: "Long live sacred Germany." Apart from in Germany, there were large resistance movements in many other countries as well. One of those countries is Norway. The Norwegian resistance was peaceful for the most part, but there were some violent acts such as sabotage. An important figure in this was Maximo Guillermo Manus. He specialized in sabotaging and did his job very well, becoming very well known. He was one of hundreds and hundreds of Norwegians who opposed Nazi occupation and tried to do their small part for the liberation of their country. An interesting point is that there was a time when Norwegians who were against the Nazi occupation in Norway started wearing paperclips on their clothes. The paperclips were not super noticeable, so they were perfect. It was about patriotism and non-compliance to the Nazis.
The French resistance. After the invasion of France in 1940, many resistance groups formed. Two major groups include the SOE, the Special Operations Executives, and the FFI, the French Forces of the Interior. These groups were created to fight back against the Germans. The SOE was created in 1940, and they mostly sent agents and supplies to different groups to help them sabotage the Germans. Other things some groups would do was publish underground papers during this time. In 1944, most resistance groups in France identified under the FFI. It was estimated that over 500,000 people participated in the French resistance, and that around 90,000 were killed, tortured, or deported. Most resistance groups also helped the Allies by providing them German intelligence and rescuing their soldiers. Some important figures in the French resistance was Charles de Gaulle and Jean Moulin. Charles de Gaulle was former president of France and the leader of the Free French forces who fought against the German forces, and Jean Moulin played a leading part in the organization of the Maquis, which were groups of soldiers who fought the Germans, and he helped develop the National Council of the Resistance, which was responsible for all non-communist groups. He was also the first chairman of this council in 1943. Later that year, he was captured by the Gestapo and he died on the train to Germany. Another important figure in the French resistance was Henri Giraud, who was an army officer and one of the leaders of the French Committee of the National Liberation, who helped fight against the Germans in World War II. Some important dates for the French resistance was the eve of D-Day, when it was reported that FFI members sent out secret messages to its members to cause maximum damage to weaken the German forces for D-Day. The Dutch resistance. The Dutch resistance was a very large group of individuals who sought out against the German occupiers from 1940 to 1945. They were involved in many different activities to fight against the Germans, such as sabotage, intelligence gathering, underground press, assistance to Jews, escape lines, and collaborating with allies. Important groups in the Dutch resistance. The first one is the NSF, the National Steun Fund. This organization provided financial support and material support to individuals hiding, and especially Jews, and they helped families in need. The second one is the Dutch Communist Party, also known as the CPN, and they were actively involved in resistance activities, and they organized different protests and helped coordinate sabotage efforts. Some important figures in the Dutch resistance included Janetje Johanna Schaft. She was also known as Hannie Schaft, or the girl with red hair. She assassinated Nazi soldiers and used her looks to seduce Nazis. The second one is Johann von Hulst. He was a teacher who was known for smuggling over 600 Jewish children out of harm's way to safety in cargo during the Second World War. And the third one is Henrietta Roland Holst. She supported the underground newspaper along with other organizations, and she used her home as a safe house for Jews in hiding from the Nazis. Some important dates in the Dutch resistance was July 1941. This was the first attack of sabotage on German troops, and September of 1943 organized a large-scale operation to destroy German infrastructure such as railroads and communication lines.
There were also other resistances throughout World War II, but these are the bigger ones who had larger impacts on the war.